Let's continue now with our study of Hersey's Hiroshima. I'm with you on page 992. Let's go ahead and read this, the American Experience box. Read with me, please. World War II. World War II began in September of 1939 when German forces, following the orders of the dictator Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. In response to this unprovoked invasion, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. Just over 2 years later, the United States entered the war when Japan, a German ally, launched a surprise attack on an American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The war continued to escalate during the early 1940s. More than 24 nations were eventually drawn into the conflict, and tens of millions of soldiers were killed. By 1945, the tide had turned strongly in favor of the United States and its allies. In early May 1945, the German forces surrendered. Fighting continued in the Pacific, however, as the Japanese refused to give up. The war finally ended in 1945 when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombs killed more than 200,000 people and forced Japan's surrender. And then in the connect to the literature question, in what ways does getting to know Dr. Fuji and the others affect your feelings about the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima? That obviously is a 3B question. Let's turn now to page 992, and we'll meet now our third character. I hope you're listing these at level 1. Our third character now in the story.
In the days right before the bombing, Dr. Masakazu Fuji, being prosperous, hedonistic, and at the time not too busy, had been allowing himself the luxury of sleeping until 9 or 9:30. But fortunately, he had to get up early the morning the bomb was dropped to see a house guest off on a train. He rose at 6, and half an hour later walked with his friend to the station, not far away, across 2 of the rivers. He was back home by 7, just as the siren sounded its sustained warning. He ate breakfast, and then, because the morning was already hot, undressed down to his underwear, and went out on the porch to read the paper. This porch, in fact the whole building, was curiously constructed. Dr. Fuji was the proprietor of a peculiarly Japanese institution, a private single-doctor hospital. This building, perched beside and over the water of the Kyo River and next to the bridge of the same name, contained 30 rooms for 30 patients and their kinfolk. For, according to Japanese custom, when a person falls sick and goes to a hospital, 1 or more members of his family go and live there with him, to cook for him, bathe, massage, and read to him, and to offer incessant familial sympathy, without which a Japanese patient would be miserable indeed. Dr. Fuji had no beds, only straw mats for his patients. He did, however, have all sorts of modern equipment, an X-ray machine, diathermy apparatus, and a fine tiled laboratory. The structure rested on 2/3 of the land, 1/3 on piles over the tidal waters of the Kyo. This overhang, the part of the building where Dr. Fuji lived, was queer-looking, but it was cool in summer, and from the porch, which faced away from the center of the city, the prospect of the river, with pleasure boats drifting up and down it, was always refreshing. Dr. Fuji had occasionally had anxious moments when the ota and its mouth branches rose to flood, but the piling was apparently firm enough, and the house had always held. Dr. Fuji had been relatively idle for about a month, because in July, as the number of untouched cities in Japan dwindled, and as Hiroshima seemed more and more inevitably a target, he began turning patients away, on the ground that in case of a fire raid, he would not be able to evacuate them. Now, he had only 2 patients left, a woman from Yano, injured in the shoulder, and a young man of 25, recovering from burns he had suffered when the steel factory near Hiroshima, in which he worked, had been hit. Dr. Fuji had 6 nurses to tend his patients. His wife and children were safe. His wife and 1 son were living outside Osaka, and another son and 2 daughters were in the country on Kyushu. A niece was living with him, and a maid and a manservant. He had little to do and did not mind, for he had saved some money. At 50, he was healthy, convivial, and calm, and he was pleased to pass the evenings drinking whiskey with friends, always sensibly and for the sake of conversation. Before the war, he had affected brands imported from Scotland and America. Now, he was perfectly satisfied with the best Japanese brand, Suntory. Dr. Fuji sat down cross-legged in his underwear on the spotless matting of the porch, put on his glasses, and started reading the Osaka Asahi. He liked to read the Osaka news because his wife was there. He saw the flash. To him, faced away from the center and looking at his paper, it seemed a brilliant yellow. Startled, he began to rise to his feet. In that moment, he was 1,550 yards from the center. The hospital leaned behind his rising, and with a terrible ripping noise, toppled into the river. The doctor, still in the act of getting to his feet, was thrown forward and around and over. He was buffeted and gripped. He lost track of everything because things were so speeded up. He felt the water. Dr. Fuji hardly had time to think that he was dying before he realized that he was alive, squeezed tightly by two long timbers in a V across his chest, like a morsel suspended between two huge chopsticks, held upright so that he could not move, with his head miraculously above water and his torso and legs in it. The remains of his hospital were all around him in a mad assortment of splintered lumber and materials for the relief of pain. His left shoulder hurt terribly. His glasses were gone.
All right, let's meet our fourth now.
Miss Toshiko Sasaki, the East Asia Tin Works clerk, got up at 3 o'clock in the morning on the day the bomb fell. There was extra housework to do. Her 11-month-old brother, Akio, had come down the day before with a serious stomach upset. Her mother had taken him to the Tamura Pediatric Hospital and was staying there with him. Miss Sasaki, who was about 20, had to cook breakfast for her father, a brother, a sister, and herself, and, since the hospital, because of the war, was unable to provide food, to prepare a whole day's meals for her mother and the baby, in time for her father, who worked in a factory making rubber earplugs for artillery crews, to take the food by on his way to the plant. When she had finished and had cleaned and put away the cooking things, it was nearly 7. The family lived in Koi, and she had a 45-minute trip to the tin works in the section of town called Kanonmachi. She was in charge of the personnel records in the factory. She left Koi at 7, and as soon as she reached the plant, she went with some of the other girls from the personnel department to the factory auditorium. A prominent local Navy man, a former employee, had committed suicide the day before by throwing himself under a train. A death considered honorable enough to warrant a memorial service, which was to be held at the tin works at 10 o'clock that morning. In the large hall, Miss Sasaki and the others made suitable preparations for the meeting. This work took about 20 minutes. Miss Sasaki went back to her office and sat down at her desk. She was quite far from the windows, which were off to her left, and behind her were a couple of tall bookcases containing all the books of the factory library, which the personnel department had organized. She settled herself at her desk, put some things in a drawer, and shifted papers. She thought that before she began to make entries in her lists of new employees, discharges and departures for the army, she would chat for a moment with the girl at her right. Just as she turned her head away from the windows, the room was filled with a blinding light. She was paralyzed by fear, fixed still in her chair for a long moment. The plant was 1,600 yards from the center. Everything fell, and Miss Sasaki lost consciousness. The ceiling dropped suddenly, and the wooden floor above collapsed in splinters, and the people up there came down, and the roof above them gave way. But principally, and first of all, the bookcases right behind her swooped forward, and the contents threw her down, with her left leg horribly twisted and breaking underneath her. There, in the tin factory, in the first moment of the atomic age, a human being was crushed by books.
Jot down really quickly what you find to be somewhat ironic about the final line that we just read. That the irony of all ironies is that at the very beginning of the atomic age, this woman was crushed by books, right? Of course, books kind of representative maybe of the pre-atomic age. And then, of course, we have the age of science, the atomic age. All right, so level 1, very simply. We have 4 characters who are described as being survivors of the dropping of the atomic weapon at Hiroshima. And notice that we can ask some questions about similarities and differences between these 4 people. For example, notice how all 4 of them had something to do with morning risings and what kind of time. Also in regards to maybe that they all noticed were reading newspapers. Did you notice this? Kind of interesting. They were reading newspapers. They all shared in common, of course, fear or anxiety about the fact that maybe the city was going to be attacked at some point, and sure enough, it was attacked. Let's jump to 2A really quickly and talk messages, themes here. What do you want to say about possible message themes in regards to this reading? One possible message or theme that has been stated often is, of course, the horrors of war. And the fact that in war, so regularly, it is civilians, complete innocents, who are going to suffer the greatest tragedies. Another possible message or theme here is that of the courage and the heroism of people in the time of tragedy, in the time of great turmoil. We are going to see, obviously, a whole lot of that. We see that picture on page 994. That is a compelling image, isn't it? Of the young man pushing a bicycle across a complete desolated wasteland. And the wonder, obviously, is how it is that he or anybody in that condition can survive something like what has transpired. Of course, another possible message or theme here to finish off 2A is the idea that sometimes in history, warfare has to decide the outcome of history. And of course, sometimes those are really problematic kinds of questions. And John Hersey, obviously, after the end of the war, is raising some very controversial questions about, was it worth it? Was it necessary? At 2B, we've already said this. Hersey takes the persona as a nonfiction writer of a journalist who is just simply what? Reporting information. Let me tell you how this whole thing went down. And of course, in the process of telling us about it, sometimes objective, sometimes a little bit more subjective, is going to give us insights into each one of these 4 lives. Let's finally make an observation. When you make these 4 people personal to the reader, it makes the dropping of the atomic weapon more personal as well. Agreed? So that you have real people who were living real lives on the day that the weapon was dropped. Compelling. Of course, at level 3, and that's where we always head, how do we relate to something like this? Let's begin, of course, at 3A with relationship to other titles. Go ahead and jot down for yourself the answer to a couple of these questions. What is for you your favorite title that talks about the atomic age? Maybe, for example, shares some of the information from this time. Do you have a title that works for you? Do you have a story that you've read or a novel that you're familiar with that's set maybe in this time that you know something about this experience? Many of my students will point out, you know what, reading this is a lot different from playing a video game where it's a shooter game and you're in wartime. Because in wartime, the devastation in video games is often de-emphasized, am I right? And the excitement of being in the wartime is, of course, emphasized. What are your thoughts about that? Do you have a video game, for example, that tries to display some of the tragedies of war, some of the horrors of war, especially to citizens? And finally, at 3B, we can ask this question. How do you deal with this whole idea of the end of the war? Are you willing to accept that it was a necessary kind of thing to end the war? Or are you of the opinion that, you know, there's another way it could have been resolved? You could have taken this weapon, you could have dropped it on an island off the coast of Japan, you could have had major military Japanese officials watch the explosion. They could have been told, this weapon will be dropped on your people if you do not surrender. Or do you think it was rather necessary for the Japanese people to actually go through the experience of loss of life to such terrible extremes for them to accept the notion of full surrender? Where do you come down on this? Where do you come down on the question of war and pacifism? Are you a pacifist? Or do you believe that sometimes war is necessary, and if we are in war, then it is necessary to finish that war by all means necessary? How do you think about that? What is your view on that? Well, there you go, an introduction to John Hersey's classic Hiroshima. I hope that you maybe get the chance to pick up the full text and read it. Thank you.